When a ship wrecked on the west coast of Africa during the Age of Sail, even brave captains were known to crack. One French captain tried to blow up the magazine of his ship. When stopped, he put 2 bullets in his throat. Another, broken by fear, lost his wits and became so defiant that he was murdered by his captors. Sailors believed that the coast was inhabited by cannibals. White slavery was a common practice in the region. I first discovered Railey's narrative on a library shelf. When I saw a spine that said Sufferings in Africa, I pulled down a musty tome and began to read. The merchant brig Commerce wrecked on the west coast of the Sahara on August 28, 1815. After reaching the shore, the crew was attacked by Arab nomads, enslaved, and marched across the barren plains. Reaching across the ages, Railey's account of their sufferings and struggles moved me intensely. Of the crew of 12, half perished on the desert. But 5 men led by Railey managed to cross the Sahara, traveling 800 miles to Essaouira, where they were ransomed. This was not a typical story of the day. I knew I had discovered a lost treasure. I became obsessed with retelling Railey's tale, so much so that I knew I had to retrace his footsteps on the Sahara. During the Middle Ages, Cape Bojador was the end of the navigable world. European ships could not get past the choppy shoals. When they finally did, they could not return. Disarmingly placid in fair weather, the Cape was a hellish wrecking ground when the seas were churned by storms, or when the searing desert wind clashed with the cold Atlantic and turned the sky into a dense blanket of fog. Railey's wooden brig, though crafted of the finest Connecticut timber, had long since washed away. But near where Railey said he had run aground, my crew and I discovered the rusted hulls of 3 modern wrecks. Walking across the sand-scoured dunes so far from home, faced with the lost dreams and prospects that these dead vessels represented, I felt my heart ache. It was my first visceral connection with Railey. After running aground in a storm and thick fog, Railey and his 11 men rowed and swam ashore. Shocked at their sudden misfortune, they were attacked by natives who stabbed and dragged off one of the men. Railey and his men took the ship's longboat and rowed out to sea, hoping to flag down a passing vessel. The surf crashed them down on a postage stamp-sized beach beneath 300-foot cliffs. With their skin burnt off by the sun and salt water, hungry and thirsty, Railey and his men crawled along these bluffs, suspended between the ocean and the continent, looking for a way to the top. I descended the same bluff on a fisherman's rope attached to a spike in the sand. Looking up from the water, I already knew what they soon found out. Above them was nothing but sand and rock. Nothing to eat, nothing to drink. When Railey and his men reached the top and stepped onto the Sahara, they fell down on their knees in grief, preparing themselves to die. There were, however, inhabitants on the coast. I was being led over the dunes by these very same people, resourceful nomads who once believed that shipwrecked Western sailors and their goods and possessions were cast upon the shore as a gift to them from God. Railey and his men had been captured by the Ouled Buspa, a fierce warring tribe that roamed from well to well and from thorn bush to thorn bush, herding their camels. Clad in loincloths and little else, the sailors' flesh was chewed raw by the camels' bristles and churning spines. When the exhausted sailors dropped off the camels on purpose or fell, they had to run across the burning sand or stony desert to keep up, where they were mercilessly beaten. Having come to connect with Railly in every way still possible, I took off my shoes and ran across this brutal, stone-pocked desert. In the Sagia El Hamra, the largest wadi in western Sahara, where it has not rained in 3 years, I encountered a victim of the desert, a bull camel that could not make it up one last incline, and that was now being stripped by the wind-borne sand and burnished by the sun, its hide thumped like a fiberglass canoe. More important than avoiding enemies on the desert is finding friends, among whom the custom of sharing is universally observed. Our guides taught us the mores of their people, who never seem to lose their sense of humor no matter how destitute. God provides for them even on the desert. And the only proper response to being passed the bowl of camel milk is not thank you, but Bismillah, in the name of God.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح.
I'd come to the Sahara to listen and to learn. It spoke to me in many ways. Sheltering from the noontime sun in a Busba home, the austerity of the region and its lavish hospitality enveloped me with melodic and spicy flourishes. When I showed the Busba chief a picture of my 4 daughters, he laid it on the floor and after a few moments slipped it furtively under his robes, never to be seen again. Why he could possibly have wanted to keep it, I could not imagine. Like Railly, I did not fully understand the Arab's notions of ownership, but I was happy for him to have it, just as I'm sure he indulged my own foibles. But it was out on the desert that I was perhaps most able to complete the triangle of connections between Railly, the Sahrawis, and myself. As my crew and I covered 100 miles on camelback from Tarfaya to Gulamim, in the southernmost reaches of Morocco, I came to understand the Arab's central possession. There is but one source of wealth on the desert, the camel. The Arabs have a saying, only those who ride camels understand camels. One might take it a step further. Only those who understand camels understand the desert. As we rounded the mountainous dunes that Railly rounded, and crossed the endless plains and salt basins that he crossed, I experienced the paradox of the cameleer, the bitter ride and the sweet feeling of flying effortlessly across the world's harshest terrain. I became attached to my camel. Its obstinate spirit was the spirit of the land, as necessary as water on the desert and more plentiful by far. Only a rider of camels understands camels. Railly understood this. He inadvertently became the first ethnographer of Western Sahara, and in his willingness to understand a new and alien culture, he brought back something even more precious to America. As a white man, he was able to give a voice to the victims of slavery, a voice that African Americans did not have. And Railly was wise enough to understand that it was not that Arabs were bad men, but that slavery was an evil institution. The desert is a place of transformation. In the face of its desolation, Railly had contemplated suicide. He had surrendered to the will of God and opened his mind to cooperation and friendship with a people he did not understand. While 5 of his shipmates were lost to the desert, Railly returned home with a story that helped change his nation.
There's light. I was in the New York Yacht Club library when I looked up on a shelf and saw on the spine of a book the word "Sufferings in Africa." And it was a temptation I couldn't resist. I pulled the book down and began to read. 2 hours later, I was still reading. It was this amazing story of struggle, of suffering, of courage, of transformation, and ultimately redemption on the Sahara. I came in the next day. I was supposed to be researching one of my Patrick O'Brien companion books, and instead I spent the entire day reading this captain's memoir. I could not put it down. It was the story of Captain James Railly, who after the War of 1812 and 1815 had sailed down the Connecticut River with a crew of 12 men in the merchant brig Commerce. Now, during the war, they had been cast ashore by the British blockade of the coast, and many sailors had been broken by that, including Railly. He'd lost all of his wealth, including his house where his wife and 4 children lived. And so this was a voyage that was hopefully going to restore them to their fortunes again. They sailed down out of the Connecticut, down to New Orleans, picked up a cargo of flour and tobacco. Then they sailed across the Atlantic to Gibraltar, where they traded the flour and tobacco for wine and Spanish coin. And then they sailed down the coast of Africa. They were going to the Cape Verde Islands to pick up salt to take back to the United States. And while they were along the coast of Africa, they got caught in a fog like you saw on the film there, got blown off course and swept onto the shore. They wrecked there. They managed to, they wrecked there off the coast. They managed to get ashore with a lot of their goods. And they were then attacked by semi-nomadic fishermen that lived there, who stabbed and dragged off one of the men and destroyed most of their goods, which was crushing because they were on the Sahara and that was what they needed to survive. You've got to realize also that at this time no Westerner had ever explored the Sahara. And the sailors believed that cannibals lived on the coast. They were petrified of these natives. And so they decided that instead of staying there and facing them, they would go back out to their shipwrecked brig and take the longboat, which had been wrecked somewhat in the surf, try to fix it up and go out to sea in the hopes of flagging down a passing ship, which was virtually impossible. But they decided that they'd rather die at sea than die at the hands of these men. So that's what they did. They salvaged some figs, some water, some wine. They went out. They had a pig. They went out for 9 days. They killed the pig, ate it. They drank their water. They drank their wine. They were bailing constantly. They were suffering because the salt water and the tropical sun was deteriorating their skin. Finally, starving and thirsty, they decided to go back to the coast. And they sailed back to the coast and wrecked beneath bluffs like you saw on the film there. It took them 3 days to get to the top again. And when they finally did, they were about to die. They saw a fire down the coast, and they decided in the morning that they would walk towards that fire. When they got there, it was a well where the Oulad Buspa were watering their camels. The Oulad Buspa came on the run the minute they saw these sailors, scimitars flying, camels racing, and they proceeded to have a battle. The battle wasn't with the sailors, it was with each other to determine who possessed each sailor, because these guys it was like finding gold. It was the jackpot. And so they stripped the sailors of all their clothes. Their clothes were very valuable. They fought over them. They divvied them up, and then they set off on the desert again, going from patch of thorn bush to patch of thorn bush, from well to well, feeding and watering their camels as they do. They lived off of basically a bowl of camel milk each day. The sailors could not live off of that. The natives were used to that, but the sailors were not. So they were starving, they were dehydrated, and finally one day a trader rode into camp from up north, a man named Sidi with his brother Saeed. And Railly realized that this was maybe his last chance for survival. And he went to Sidi and he eventually convinced him to buy him and as many of his men as he could gather up and to transport them 800 miles across the Sahara to Essaouira, then known in the West as Mogador, in order to ransom them. And Railly also, Sidi was also desperate. He had been sent down onto the desert by his father-in-law, having been on a caravan to Timbuktu that was disastrous, and owing his father-in-law now from that. He was sent down there with blue cloth and ostrich feathers to trade with the natives. And he realized here was a chance if he could take these sailors, transport them across the Sahara, past warring tribes, past warlords in the south of Morocco, and past the Sultan's own men who would take them if he caught them, he would be able to restore his fortunes and be back in good standing with his own people. And so he decided to take this risk. Now, he didn't know Railly, of course, and he made Railly promise that Railly knew somebody in Essaouira who would put up the money to ransom him. And he took Railly's word. He also made Railly promise that if he was lying, that he would allow Sidi to slit his throat. So as they try to cross this desert, 800 miles, Railly's living basically under a death sentence. And as they go, Railly and Sidi begin to develop a friendship and a mutual respect. Railly realizes that Sidi can navigate by using the stars and smelling the sand, that he can find water in this barren desert. And Sidi realizes that Railly can motivate his men even though they're dehydrated and starving and emaciated. In the end, Railly, who started out at 240 pounds, would weigh only 120 pounds. And he would report that 2 of his men weighed less than 40 pounds. And so, and Sidi respected Railly for being able to keep the discipline, for motivating his men so that they could keep moving across the desert. They were both very devout men, too, in their own religions. And at one point, they're attacked by robbers. And Sidi says to Railly, after they survived this against the odds, he said, "You know, I believe you're blessed by God because you've survived so much, and I know back there we would have been killed if it weren't for you. So you must be blessed by God." And so you have this great tension of this death sentence, of this great promise of freedom if they make the journey, of this budding friendship as they cross the desert. And when I read this memoir, I realized that it was much more significant than other memoirs I'd read of other sailors who tend to tell pretty far-fetched tales, often pretty wooden, and here was something from 1815 that was well written, had a lot of great detail, was very believable. I also discovered when I went out to research this memoir that another sailor on the ship had written a memoir about the shipwreck, and that Abraham Lincoln had said that it was one of the 6 books that had most affected him as a youth. Included in those six books were the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Pilgrim's Progress, and 2 histories, one of Jefferson and one of Washington. So it was in pretty good company, and I figured because it was about this brutal slavery that it might have had a significant impact on American history. At that point, I decided that I wanted to retell this story. I also, of course, saw that there were a lot of interesting lessons to be learned, not only from this struggle overcoming these great odds, but in this clash of East-West that would be very pertinent today. At the same time that Lincoln loved this book, and many people loved this book, Railly's name was a household name in the country in 1815. There were a lot of critics. Nobody had ever explored Western Sahara. Railly came back with some pretty far-fetched stories. And so I knew that I needed to go to the Western Sahara to check out what Railly had reported, to see the bluffs he had seen, to sleep on the hard desert that he had reported about, to meet these nomads if that was possible. I planned a trip with the help of National Geographic Adventure and Little Brown, and it just so happened that I'd planned it for the week following 9/11. I planned it a year ahead of time. When 9/11 happened, of course, the world was set on its head. I had to readjust my crew, replan. I was able to get over there 3 weeks later. We landed in Casablanca on the day that the United States began bombing Afghanistan. So it was a pretty dicey, tense time to be there. We flew down to Layun, Western Sahara, Now, Western Sahara used to be Spanish Sahara until 1975, when the Spaniards pulled out, the Moroccans invaded from the north, the Mauritanians invaded from the south, and the Algerians supported an indigenous movement there. And so that situation has never been resolved. The longest-standing UN refugee camps in the world are on the Mauritanian-Western Sahara border. And there's supposed to be a UN-sponsored referendum there to determine who controls this territory. However, in 1976, the Moroccans marched 300,000 people down there in the Green March and changed the population. So it's been at a stalemate ever since, and nobody's figured out quite how to resolve this situation. When we got there, the territory is basically controlled by the Moroccan military and national police, who proceeded to make my trip pretty miserable. They were very tense about having Westerners there at that time, and even though I'd had promises from the Moroccan National Tourism Board that everything was approved for me to go ahead and go into the desert and take this trip, the Army colonels thought that was kind of cute that I'd gone to the National Tourism Board and didn't really care so much that I had that approval. I got to the place where you saw where the shipwreck was. I was going to take a boat down to where they had wrecked again below those bluffs. They wouldn't let me do that. They took us onto an Army base, interrogated us, took our ID papers, and sent us packing up north. And so at that point, I wasn't able to go inland to where Riley's route, Riley indicated in a map that he had gone. Of course, when Riley was there were no maps of this territory, and he had no navigational tools, so he took the best stab that he could at what his route was. I was crestfallen by this. I'd gone there to get the empirical evidence to support my story. But it turned out that we went up a little north of the old Spanish Sahara Moroccan border and started our camel trek there. And at that point, I started learning things that I thought I would not be able to learn, that I ended up being much more valuable than the empirical data about the route that I could have gotten. On the very first day that we started riding the camels, Muhammad El Arab, the guy you saw there who I passed the bowl of camel milk to, who is a camel jockey instructor from Marrakesh. He was born on the desert. His father was a mercenary warrior, had 7 wives across the desert. Muhammad turned out to be a wonderful teacher. He knew that I wanted to find out more about the Ouled Busba. He was from the Regubah tribe, and in 1910 the Regubah slaughtered most of the Ouled Busba in one of their tribal wars. And so he took me deep into the desert to find the Ouled Busba. And Muhammad, when we would pass that bowl of camel milk and I would try to take it and say thank you, Muhammad wouldn't hand it to me. It was like I was a kid. He was teaching me. Only if I said Bismillah, which means in the name of God. And they consider everything to be given to them by God, their food, their water, and everything on the desert is shared and shared alike. If you sit down and light a little fire and start fixing tea on the desert and you see nobody around, all of a sudden you'll see somebody pop up on the horizon and they'll start wandering around. It's like a ball traveling to a magnet. You know, pretty soon it's curving right into your camp. And they come in, they hug our guides share out everything we have and serve them first. This tradition of hospitality really still exists. And all desert travelers discover this at some point. Riley did very poignantly in a scene where Sidi Hamet buys a camel, and this camel, they slaughter this camel, they cook it, and it's going to be their food to go 800 miles across the Sahara. He knows he needs to feed Riley and his men. Well, as soon as they start cooking it, nomads come pouring over the dunes and proceed to wipe out that camel. They eat the whole thing. Sidi Hamet never stops him, and Riley wonders why, and he's distraught. Why doesn't Sidi Hamet stop them? This is our food. And but Sidi Hamet knows this is the custom of the desert. You feed anybody who comes to your camp first. Lawrence reported that. Thesiger reported that. And so that's something that all Westerners learn at some point. Now, Muhammad, at night we would sit under a Berber tent, rugs, and under a beautiful night sky. And as soon as I'd gotten there, before we left the city, I said, Muhammad, you know, I really would like to get a sheep shin bone pipe and some of that stuff you smoke to ward off evil eye. Muhammad goes, okay, give me $5. He runs into a kiosk and comes back with a sheep shin bone pipe in Menaji, which I'm told is Mauritanian tobacco. And every night he smokes this sheep shin bone pipe with the Mauritanian tobacco. And we have long conversations. And he tells me about the ways of his family, about the desert crossings. And I show him the map, Riley's map, and he says, oh yes, I know why they went there. That's an Ouled Busba well. and I look on a map and I see beer, whatever, and yes, it is a well, and so I do get those map details from him, plus all the ways of their life on the desert. And so this is great stuff for me. But Railly had his own transformation on the desert, much more profound than mine. When they had gotten up onto the desert with his men and were traveling around, he had been trying to control events, to get his men, to shepherd them across the desert. And at one point it had become too much for him, the physical stress, the mental stress, and seeing his men fading and growing more emaciated had caused him to decide that he was going to commit suicide. He couldn't take it anymore. He stopped, found a rock, which he was going to use, as he put it, to bash his brains in. He got through this crisis. He didn't bash his brains in. But from that time on, he realized that he couldn't make things happen. He could only respond to them. He could help try to guide his men, make the right decisions, and go with the will of God. And he talks about that through the rest of his trip. And Railly, in befriending Sidi Hamet, was doing something pretty amazing. The other sailors looked upon these people as savages, that they were put out here to be punished. But Railly looked at them as more human beings and tried to relate with them. I think that's a great lesson. I think also in today, when we have this East-West clash, I learned both in Railly's story and in my own experience that the only way to bridge this gulf in religions and cultures is this human interaction, to be together. And you quickly put aside your philosophical differences, I think, as you're striving to achieve a common goal. And I think that's what we need more of. Now I'll take questions. Other questions? Yes?
Who paid Railly's ransom?
Well, that's another remarkable story. It was a British consul general, and this again is right after the War of 1812, so relations between the United States and Britain are pretty rocky. But this guy, who subsequently became pretty famous for ransoming sailors off the desert, immediately responded to the ransom note saying, "Yes, I know Railly, and I will pay his ransom." And that saved Railly's life. And forever after, Railly was grateful to this man, William Wilshire. And Railly came back, and eventually he left Connecticut. He went into Ohio. He was a surveyor of Ohio and became a state congressman. And he named a town after this man, Wilshire, William Wilshire. There is, to this day, Wilshire, Ohio. Yes?
What happened to Sidi Hamet?
Question is, what happened to Sidi Hamet? Sidi Hamet... interestingly enough, Sidi Hamet, after ransoming, getting his ransom for Railly, they had become friends. Sidi Hamet stayed there at Wilshire's house for a couple weeks, waiting for the promised guns to come. And during that time, Railly interviewed him. And so at the back of Railly's memoir, you have Sidi Hamet's whole story. And that's really remarkable for something from 1815. And that's what gave me the ability to give you a round character in the story. But Sidi Hamet eventually, he promises Railly to go back down to the desert to try to save his men. And there's a gut-wrenching scene before Railly heads off. Archibald Robbins is brought in by his master, who tries to sell him to Sidi Hamet, but Sidi Hamet has run out of goods and can't buy him. So this sort of heartbreaking scene where Archibald Robbins is left behind on the Sahara, knowing this is maybe his last good chance to get off the desert. And Railly promises him that he'll do everything he can to get the other men off the desert, which he does. He gets Sidi Hamet to promise to go back down to the desert. He goes to the American consul who's in the north of Morocco and persuades him to put up some money to go save them. And then he comes over to Washington, D.C. and meets with James Monroe and gets Congress to put up money to save these guys. So he does everything he can. In the meantime, Sidi Hamet goes back down to try to rescue them and is eventually killed in a raid.